Of course, yesterday we stressed a lot all the compliments and all the thank yous, but I would like to reinforce the fact that the National Council is supporting this event, the fact that everybody is coming here. I would like to thank you also, the ones that were yesterday till midnight here. So I would start where we ended yesterday, because I think the roundtable discussion and the conversation yesterday really got to the point where we are now, because we were talking about buildings, we were talking about old buildings, new buildings, preserving them, working with them, learning from them, actually also criticizing approaches in Kuwait, what are the chronicle issues. So today it's the right time to talk about the architects and to talk about the role. So basically tonight, as yesterday, we will have a first part that is composed of 4 interventions, very short presentations that aim to work as teasers. Then we have a little coffee break for us to set together a duania here, kind of. And then we have a discussion where all our guests for the discussion will comment on the presentations, and then the discussion will be open to the public. So I brought again Mr. Amp's presentation in Hong Kong in 1953, because it talks a lot about what was the state of that moment, talks a lot about bringing architects, engineers and everyone from outside to Kuwait, because there were no professionals here, talks a lot about the need for the resources, so bringing bricks, bringing inerts for the concrete, bringing even sand for the concrete. It talks a lot also about the prosperity, about money, where the millions of dollars will be spent, how building will address that or will affect that, and the presentation of somehow the first, considered to be one of the first building entities of this modernization process, started in 1950 with the Department of Public Works. This is, I just messed up, this is not a clear logic chronology. This is parts of the chronology from Making of the City from Stefan Gardiner, together with information that I gathered from yesterday's discussion. So here we can see, like, from the little conversation we had yesterday, what is in the chronology of Gardiner and what is missing. So you can see what is typed and what is scanned. So this tells a lot about what we know about architecture, about architects, and about this modernization, which I think is very little for Kuwait. Also, the topic of Fahed al-Salam Street and the fascism and this idea of what is architecture or what is not, what's the understanding. I think today is also a good day to talk about this tradition of what means exactly Mohandas, and I think this can be an interesting topic. The idea of constructive systems and local culture of construction, if it was interrupted or if this modernization process is a continuation of something, and where are you today? Also the issue of materiality that was stressed yesterday, the influence of all these corporates and all this world around Kuwait during certain period, the translation of public spaces into buildings, the translation of parking plots into sandwiches, as was here yesterday talked about. Basically, the overlap of grounds. Another issue that I think we should talk all about is what Kuwaiti architects have to say to this, what this relates to them, what they understand of this. What is vernacular in Kuwait even, what's the fragility of these buildings, what's the backwards and the front, what's adaptation, what's reuse, what's transformation, what are the new corners of the city, what are the skyscrapers and how we will demolish them, and what is Sabia. So I will invite now Michael Kubu for his presentation. So we will have first Michael Kubu, then Nasser, Ivan, and Aziz Al-Khatami. So the idea would be each one of the presenters here will talk a lot about their experience as architects and how diverse it can be. I think that's the main point. So I would invite Michael.
So, thanks again. So the title of this talk in the flyer doesn't correspond in any way to the talk I'm actually going to give. It's not about Kuwait. This is kind of the opposite side of my work and of my background. And it's nice in a way that I think what I'm going to present today picks up, I think, where we left off in the discussion yesterday, which was about the issue of buildings. That buildings are not just buildings. Buildings are also a form of culture. And buildings are a form of cultural production. They produce cultural effects. And so today I'm going to talk about the architect as a cultural producer and architecture as something you can understand as a field of cultural production, not simply about the making of buildings, by talking about architects that do things other than produce architecture with their background and as a way of having effects both within the discipline and outside. And I'll do it by presenting my own background as one of these people, and in a way that my own background, as you'll see, produced certain projects that were about studying the role of an architect as a cultural producer, largely as a way of finding a place for myself within the discipline, because I had ended up doing various other sorts of things with my background as an architect. So I'm trained as an architect. I started working out of this training at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. I was there as an editor, not as an architect. So I was there to produce books in this kind of heavily collaborative, very intense environment with a lot of exchange of ideas. And so I was there to work on books, but book production was also a very heavy part of the office in their architectural work and in their mode of thinking. Books were produced all the time by all of the employees, all of the teams. Books would be produced. This was very often the way that projects would be presented to Koolhaas. His way of understanding the project was largely through book production. So one always had to make an argument. One always had to clarify one's attitude and make a narrative or tell a story or structure an argument through this device of the book. And so every project team was constantly cranking out book after book after book, sometimes on a weekly basis. This was for the clients, this was for the teams themselves to understand their own work, but it was also for Koolhaas to understand. And this was a very inspiring model, that using a kind of discursive device to have to structure the way that you think as an architect, and it gives you a kind of better way of practicing as an architect. And so the combination of this editorial work and the book production, etc., by the time that I sort of went back and then finished the second round of my training as an architect, you could say I was already off the path. So this is at Harvard, the exhibition of the thesis, work of all the graduating thesis students in the year that I graduated, and so you can tell which one is mine. Out of all of the projects, right? So everybody, except I was the only one who produced a book and sort of somehow was apart from everybody else. So I became a book person very quickly. So then I went to work for a publisher. So I worked for Actar Publishers in Barcelona and then opened a branch office for them in New York. And Actar, again, was a very unusual publisher in that all of the editors in the office who were responsible for the book projects were all trained as architects. And so for us, to do these books was to act as architects within the field and to have our effects, to put down any stakes in the field in terms of discussions we thought mattered, conversations that needed to happen, points that needed to get clarified, etc., issues that needed to be raised, that we would do it through the medium of the book, and that this would be a stronger way of putting stakes down for us than through the construction of buildings at that particular moment. So by having a curatorial role within the field, that we could have stronger effects than we would be able to have by trying to build up a practice as builders. And one of the major ways we did this was through this series of books, which we called a bookazine. It was sort of half book, half magazine, called Verb. And so this was our own production that we edited in-house. It was not done on commission. It was not done for anybody else. It was a serial book kind of magazine that we would use to have a different theme for each issue and kind of raise issues that we thought were vital to the discipline, promote projects that we thought needed to be promoted, and then spin off other kinds of book projects as a result of it. It was incredibly laborious, so we had to do all sorts of other books in order to be able to support this as our own internal contribution to the discipline, which generally did not make money, but we thought was important. And then books led into curatorial work, so this was when we started the branch office in New York. We did an exhibition of the entire history of Akhtar's books, and so suddenly an exhibition about books kind of led into curatorial practice. And that's mostly the work that I've been doing in Boston. I run a gallery with 2 other people called Pink Comma, and it's Boston is a town where the discourse about architecture is very dominated by universities, and specifically by Harvard and MIT, and now by sort of other universities increasingly. But Harvard and MIT have always been the poles. All of the discourse, all of the lecture series, all of the conversations, all of the people that are invited in sort of flow around these poles. And we saw a need for professional practicing architects for a kind of third space where there would still be a similar intellectual level of discussion, but that wouldn't be academically driven by the motivations of Harvard or of MIT, which were not always what we were interested in, and to kind of close the gap between just a kind of technical world of professional practice and what we thought of as a very academic kind of discourse. And so we did it by having an exhibition space and a space where we could have panel discussions, where we could organize events, where we could basically make a community for architects in Boston, typically young architects, to talk with each other about issues that were important to them. And so one of the first projects that I worked on through this gallery was a research project on architects, the history of architects as publishers. And again, this is what I mean about, it was a project that came very much out of my own background and a desire to find out how common was this? Was I the only one? Or to what extent have architects operated as publishers in the 20th century and before that? And of course, it turns out, if you make a list of the most famous architects in the 20th century, anyone you can think of, Korb, Mies, etc., the most famous architect also is basically the list of the architects that were the most heavily involved with publishing practices, either as editors, as publishers. They ran publishing houses, they produced manifestos, they edited pamphlets or journals, they were journalists for newspapers, they launched magazines, etc. And so this discursive role was largely what gave them the ability then to produce certain kinds of work and to have a sort of ricochet effect between publishing practice and building practice, and all of that together was architectural practice, right? So to kind of break down the distinction that the only thing architects do are buildings. And I did it through a series of case studies of 10 canonical books in the 20th century, beginning with Towards a New Architecture and ending with SMLXL as, in a way, possibly the last canonical book. A canonical book was a book that, at least in the West, if you took a slice through the field at sort of any location in a given year, you might expect to find this book as common currency, as a shared kind of knowledge on everybody's desk. Everybody would know the contents of this book rather intimately, and that provided a kind of knowledge basis for the discipline and for disciplinary discussions. We also did a survey of 500 practicing architects, or people that had been trained as architects, and asked them to list 5 books that were influential for them, just to see which were the most listed. SMLXL was number 1. That's that, right? And so this is a graph of all of the books organized on a timeline, and then the number of time, the height of the city. It's like a city made out of books. The stacks are organized by the number of times people listed them. And so we found out that everything was kind of flat, but then you would get these peaks of massively influential books. SMLXL, this is the top 10 or 20. SMLXL, Delirious New York was number 2, Learning from Las Vegas, Complexity and Contradiction. And these were all case studies. These were all included in the 10 case studies. And so it kind of confirmed that the books that we thought had been influential indeed were influential. And the results of this were very interesting. We also, as part of the survey, asked questions about what do you read books for as? Are books the same kind of thing as architectural production? What will happen to architectural books? And so it was a project about the production, circulation, and reception of publishing practices in architecture as part and parcel of what architects do. And then this is ricocheted into a series of other projects. We did an exhibition called Newsstand, which was about the newspaper as a format. And so this was a moment when there were a series of exhibitions and people that were talking about the newspaper as a kind of dead format. Newspapers are dead, nobody reads them anymore, it's gone out, the digital has killed the newspaper, among other things. But at the same time, we saw a lot of people in architecture and in graphic design suddenly starting to print things on newsprint because they found out it was cheap, very cost-effective. You could get thousands of copies. You could get them on the street. It was mobile, and they were very flexible. You could leave them on the subway or leave them in a bar. It was transferable. It was not precious, and we wanted to know why. And so again, We made our own newspaper. In addition to collecting newspapers, about 30 different examples of people, mostly architects, who are working in this format, and asked them a series of questions through another survey, and asked them, why are you interested in the newspaper? Why do you use this format? How do you think it relays onto your architectural work, et cetera? And then collected their answers in this questionnaire as a newspaper that we then produced, right? But we've done other things. We produced a design biennial for the first time in Boston. Boston didn't have a biennial, and we thought New York had something like that, LA had something like that. We wanted one, and nobody else was doing it, so we just decided to do it. And that was 2 years ago, and we're now doing the next version. Sometimes it produces archival research projects, and this is something that resonates, I think, very heavily with the work that was discussed yesterday and the conversation about what is the role of this particular generation of buildings in Kuwait and how we receive them now. This is an ongoing project called Heroic, about Boston concrete architecture from 1960 to 1976. It's more commonly known as brutalist architecture, but we think is a terrible term, so we've rebranded it as Heroic. We don't use the term brutalist, which is a sort of lousy term. And it's a research project to build up an archive on the legacy of concrete buildings that were produced in Boston at the time, which was the leading architects produced incredibly sophisticated, some of the real highlights of concrete production anywhere in the world in this period. And Boston has the largest existing example of all of these buildings. And so it's very much like some of the work that was discussed yesterday, is to build up really a database of information and to curate that database as a platform for trying to initiate new conversations in Boston about the legacy of these buildings, their preservation, their role, et cetera. And then finally, we've started to curate exhibitions at the Boston Society of Architects, which is a new gallery space that is kind of the first major public exhibition space for architecture and design in Boston. And we've been asked to curate their exhibitions for the first year of their existence, which is now, it's sort of ongoing. And the first exhibition we did was called Inform, and it was to kind of retell the history of Boston to Bostonians, to architects and also to the public, about a legacy of projects that people forgot about and that we are trying to revive. And so the discussion yesterday about sometimes projects from the past are projecting a future that you can activate sort of in the present. You can go back and recover futures that were somehow lost. This, for example, was a cybernetic information center that was built as a test prototype in Boston and existed for 1 month in 1969, and for which there are no drawings, there are only photos. Very few people remember this project, and where we had to kind of reconstruct the project from scratch out of these photos and reconstruct how it had worked, et cetera, and kind of represent it to Bostonians as a more radical moment in the city than most people tend to think of Boston as being able to produce now. We did an archival political history of a project for a world bicentennial megastructure in Boston in 1976 that very nearly was built. It would have been a whole new neighborhood built on floating platforms in the water. It would have been something like $1 billion in revenue for the city. And we reconstructed an architectural and political timeline of the complete history of this project and presented it on this very long wall from beginning to end, and all the political fights that killed it, local fights, the national fights, the funding issues, et cetera, to show the public how these debates play out, essentially. We also decided there needs to be a database on information about Boston buildings so that the public can just walk in, and if it should be understood that there's an information resource in the city about what architecture is interesting and where you find it. And so we made a database. We developed an iPad app and a series of stands for these iPads that's linked to a projection of the city of Boston so that you can collect information about how to access these buildings, et cetera. And then the last exhibition, which is up now, is called Let's Talk About Bikes. And it's about bicycles and bike culture as a kind of new introduction in Boston that's had a very big impact, and about the role of designers in shaping the conversation around cycling and issues of environment and sustainability that are quite heavily reshaping the way that projects in Boston tend to happen and the way that people live in the city. Anyway, so that's sort of a case study of the capacity of architects to have effect within both the discipline of architecture and for a broader public by means other than the production of buildings themselves. At least that's what we hope to have done. So, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We will have now Nasser Abul Hassan.
Good evening, everyone. It's always difficult, actually, to talk to a group about your work, and we've been asked to talk about AGI architects here. So what we decided to do is actually to, instead of talking about the firm, actually we wanted to talk about the current architectural situation here in Kuwait, and we wanted to frame it into 3 different topics: the constraints, the challenges, and the opportunities. So welcome to Kuwait. Of course, we all know where Kuwait is. The situation around Kuwait is actually quite festive or hectic or vibrant, as we all know. It's an area that has historically always been active. So since the creation of Kuwait and even before, there's always been an incident. And if you look in history, it's always an active area. So we welcome constraints. So one of the main constraints, we all know, the parliament. Another constraint, I'm talking about towards architects, the municipality. And the third constraint is the municipal council. You all know these 3, and you know their effects. So we welcome challenges: social, economical, political, cultural, and I assume you've seen these images on billboards wallpapered all over Kuwait. Urban. This is actually a neighborhood in Kuwait. Infrastructure. This is not far away from here, about 2 minutes walk. Institutional. Unfortunately, this is actually 2 different institutes in Kuwait. They're both government institutions, and this is the situation in there. So we welcome opportunities. I haven't showed these images to actually put anyone down. Actually, I've showed these images earlier because I think these are where our opportunity as young architects stand. And as probably all of you know, we are actually a practicing firm that is with our offices in Madrid and an office here in Kuwait. We do have a number of actually Kuwaiti architects. We have a very large number of interns that work with us and continuously actually come to our office. We teach in the university, as well actually as we have a team of more than 8 different nationalities that work in the firm. So these opportunities and these challenges and constraints that I talked about earlier is where we start as a firm. And I think where you should all start, because these opportunities that Kuwait creates to all of us is actually where innovation should start. And I'll just pinpoint a few of these opportunities. So land use. What we have done actually in this presentation, we actually have placed images of the existing and images from other examples elsewhere in the world as types of opportunities. So you know this market, which is literally across the street, and you know a market with a different scale, but still within an urban environment in Barcelona that was an opportunity, because at one point this market in Barcelona was a rundown market like this one is. Street connectivity. This is an intersection, again, within Kuwait City, and these are different intersections elsewhere in the world, so another opportunity for us as architects. Open spaces. You guys know where this is. This is a Kuwait municipality, and these are different examples elsewhere in the world of open spaces. Open plazas. This has been fenced. This is Safat Square. It has been fenced around for the past year. No one knows what's going to happen. And this is an example of another plaza elsewhere in the world that you could see or begin to read the difference in definition. Public parks. I don't know if you ever have visited these two parks. One of them is actually the entertainment city, and the other one is in Ras al-Salmiya, which is Jazira al-Khadra, which is the green island. They're sad. But guys, they're sad, but they're sad towards us as a young generation. This is a point where we could look at them as public parks, and we could look at opportunities of how do we improve public parks, how do we design public parks. Because if you look at, and this is an example, the Green Island, which unfortunately was designed by a Boston firm called Sasaki, with the rest of the master plan of the waterfront, okay, was designed without even any concerns of climate, who's going to use that, why are they going to use that, because there's not even one shading device there. The trees barely grow, okay? You cannot even stand anywhere around it. So what I'm trying to say is, what we have suffered is the lack of all of you, okay? There weren't enough architects at that time. There weren't enough local architects at that time. And I don't think we should just look at these opportunities as missed opportunities. I think we should look at them as actually something that we should start to design and something we should start to improve on. Organized streetscapes. You remember crossing the street, and you have seen many of these images. And these are different examples, again, elsewhere in the world of proper cross passes. And these were all urban improvements. And that means that we have an opportunity to improve our urban environment. Again, organized services. This is the situation of garbage collection. And this is actually the improvement of garbage collection in cities like Denmark and Barcelona and elsewhere. Play areas, what we know as play areas, and what is the opportunity of public play areas. Public transit. Again, you've seen the white buses all over. And these are cities like Colombia, where the public transportation system has drastically improved in the past few years. Bus shelters, institutes. These are institutes here in Kuwait, and this is examples of elsewhere in the world. So constraints, challenges, and opportunities. These are the main three items that we'd like to talk about. And as a firm, we believe that we're on the verge of actually producing some solutions, whether they want on a residential scale or more leisure, or again, multifamily residential projects, or what I talked about yesterday, which is larger community spaces, or even cultural projects, or this is not in Kuwait, but it's actually a workplace, or even we're involved in quite a number of actually healthcare projects, and last but not least, actually schools. So I would like to end by saying that we have a great opportunity here, and I think you all are the future of actually design in Kuwait. So you shouldn't complain about the lousy seat you're sitting on, because you should be able to design a better one. And you shouldn't complain about the lack or the heat within this space, because someone placed the air condition where the hot air is going. So it's blowing in the wrong direction. You, all of you, should look at it as an opportunity to improve the current design environment here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. So now I would call Ivan Rupnik.
Okay, hello again. Nice to see you 24 hours later, everyone who's back. So yesterday I talked a little bit about a research project on a city, and I talked a little bit about a design project that I was working on that was related to that research project in the city of Zagreb. Today I'm going to talk about another book and another design project, but a different kind of design project, also in Croatia. So what I've been working on for a while is researching what I call the peripheral moment in Croatia, which was a period of very productive architectural production between 1998 and 2008, 2009. Immediately following the war in Croatia, the 5-year war, and basically the end of occupation of the country around 98, 99. So from 98 to 2008, a very productive period occurred. And it occurred in a context that had no real economic boom. There was really, Croatia is not a particularly poor country, but it wasn't a particularly rich country. There wasn't any real particular funding. The boom was really produced by architects. And it had a lot to do with the structure of public competitions, the structure of the building code that was being rewritten at the time, as Ricardo pointed out, in Portugal in the 50s. And it was really a project by architects for architects to create a market for themselves, to create a position in society, to create all the things we've been talking about. And then it ended, and I'll talk a little about that. And then I'll show you a project that I've been working on, which has a new paradigm in Croatia having to do with the European Union and a new kind of funding structure, which has changed the paradigm. So I'll show you two different paradigms. So these are just two images from the book on the peripheral moment. On the left is projects that responded to the damage, the destruction of the war. On the right, the resurgence of kind of traditional culture after the war, after the fall of socialism. So you might even find some similarities, but also the fact that architects were very much involved in managing these translations and these transitions. And let me just back up. The idea of the peripheral moment comes from a theory of a local art historian, Ljubo Karaman. Karaman's actually a Turkish name, but we have all kinds of Turkish last names in Croatia, which is very, very, very exciting. But Ljubo Karaman had a theory about what he called the center, the province, and the periphery. So the center is a place of cultural production, a Paris, a Berlin, an Istanbul, a New York. It's a place that sort of sends messages out, but it's also a place where artists are limited by the strong patronage system. They're limited by conventions. The province is a place that receives the information from the center, and it's sort of given to it in a way that is very determined by a single center. And then he defined the idea of a periphery, and the idea of a periphery was that unlike a center, it had certain freedoms from patronage system, from strong control, and unlike a province, it was able to choose and mix, or not even choose, but manage multiple influences from multiple centers. And the periphery had created a kind of condition which was both problematic and provocative for architects, for artists, in the sense that no one supported your work, but no one prevented your work. So you had access to certain knowledge, which is very important, as we found, and you had no support and no limitations. So this is something that I think was very useful for thinking about this period too. And so the other thing that I also discovered was the roots of this kind of architectural culture had very much to do, as Michael has pointed out, and as Ricardo has, and the rest of, and the organizers from the National Council have done, the roots came from exhibitions, the roots came from public discourse, the roots came from actually architects doing a biennale on the main square in the city, really presenting themselves, putting themselves out there, having workshops on very specific projects, and also even creating temporary experiments in the city as ways to test ideas and then actually take them away. So this is a diagram of what I call the peripheral moment. It's the mapping of public competitions framed by architects from 1998 till 2009, 2010. This is 2006. And what I tried to do was just look at, these were all projects that were built. These were all projects that were, again, juries were coming from the discipline. The rules were written by architects. And it had told us something about the kind of productivity of that moment. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about the book structure so much. But what I did was in the book was I looked at a series of conditions, as Nasser pointed out, as conventions that architects dealt with, not sites, not typologies, but conditions, and how architects worked within those conditions. So this is just a page looking at architects playing with the big box typology and what architects could invent within the conventions of a big box typology. And one of the most famous projects from Croatia in the 90s is the Nirić and Nirić Baumax shopping center, where again the architects were able to play with the kind of figure ground logics, even the sort of programming of what is a very ubiquitous and American typology. But what I also was looking at very quickly, and I'll jump through this quickly, is that Croatia did have other peripheral moments. So this is a photograph of the SIAM conference in Amsterdam in 1935. The two red circles are the two Croatian participants, and the rest of the guys are the famous Gropius and Gideon and so on and so forth. The one on the right is Vladimir Antolić, who I actually showed some of his work last time. He's almost falling off the side of the photograph here. And the guy in the middle with his eyes closed is Ernst Weizmann, who actually became the head of the UN housing program in the post-war and actually impacted even policies in Kuwait. So two very interesting characters that, in a way, were participating in international discourse, but also bringing it home. But what's very important at the same time, so in the 20s and 30s, there was a local group. So there was SIAM, but there was a local group called Zemlja, or Earth, which was a group of local architects that also were trained abroad, but that were much more engaged in local problems, in the vernacular of, let's say, traditions that were living in Croatia, but also the new issues of the contemporary city. And they also interacted with artists, but also with sociologists. And they were able to translate certain techniques, but also create knowledge that was important for later. And so I'm not going to go through, I was going to give you an example, but I'm going to just cut through that quickly. So anyway, just to explain the image here, the mapping of these competitions, for a number of reasons, having less to do with economic recession, more to do with a collapse of the network of architects and the relationships, and something that I can't talk about now, but was very interesting. It was very disciplinary and not economic. This peripheral moment ended. And what happened was, in 2008, 2009, architects became very conflicted again, as they normally were. The Society of Architects, which was the place where all this was hosted, stopped really becoming the place of innovation. And I would say it prepared the way for a weak discipline within what was a very weak economy. But then in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, I've had the opportunity to consult with the University of Zagreb, who have received, the University of Zagreb, which is the main university in Croatia, received a 98-hectare military base within the city from the Ministry of War, let's say, to turn into a new campus. There was no funding for it. They just got they got the piece of land and said, good luck. There's no even funding for the competition. There's no funding for research. So they asked me if I wanted to work on this project. And what I started to do was, knowing that the researched the city, that I understood certain systems in the city, and they asked me to research the project, to put a team of experts together from Harvard, from the ETH in Zurich, also from local areas, to develop a kind of program, a new kind of competition brief that was, again, looking at the idea of how you can curate an architectural project before the competition is ever done. How do you create stimulating briefs? How do you create stimulating parameters, knowing the problems that we have with building codes, knowing the problems that we have with zoning, knowing the problem that all of these things are written by people that have no ambitions to influence built environment in bad or good ways. They just don't care. So again, looking at the history of the city, I'm not going to go into this, looking at the history of workshops that were done in the past in Zagreb and the effect they had on specific buildings, even though those workshops didn't necessarily deal with those specific issues, as a kind of operative tool, and then developing, these are just the results of certain workshops. But just one point, these are the kind of clusters of the academic buildings in Zagreb. The red is a tram loop that is unfinished, and interestingly enough, is only finished through our project, and an existing rail system. So even looking at the larger strategic planning and starting to lobby for traffic planning to be the first step before the competition is even framed. So this is the first part of the design project, which we did as a team before there was a competition, was actually designing the traffic planning, which makes sense, but not having traffic planners do it, having them consult with us. And then developing a kind of program, working with the faculties, but also working with architects and seeing how we could rethink the way program was defined, restricted, flexible, how much information they needed, and so on and so forth. And again, then working with the city planning office, looking at how that works. And actually, in the end, a year and a half ago, an international jury and a local competition chose a project by Neeraj Plus Architects. And what was interesting, just in closing, was that this project, because of this project, in the end, was something that we also developed European Union applications for funding. We found that that was the best mechanism. We had this land, we didn't have the money for the competition or the construction, but the EU imposed certain deadlines that Croatians couldn't really match. And so what happened was that a competition for a 98-hectare site, which should have lasted a year, got shrunken down to 3 months. And the reason I say this is that most of the architects didn't attend our workshops that we made public. They didn't listen to the experts that we brought. 2 firms that did were the firms that produced works that people like Joan Busquets, people like other experts, my brain is a little bit, Matteo Schuler, for example, recognized as very local responses, but also that were reflecting certain issues that were very global. And that, in a way, our, let's say, curatorial work helped local architects prepare a response that addressed very global issues. And that's actually really a very different kind of design process that I think is something that can be translated very directly here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. I would call now Aziz Al-Khatami.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be talking about a simple operation we did in our studio 2 years ago when we moved back from New York and Zurich. And in Atelier Aziz Al-Khatami, we became obsessed about what's the idea that's missing in Kuwait, or what's the obsession of people in Kuwait. And basically, we found that everyone is obsessed with hygiene, and it became like a hygienic city that people are thirsty for renewal over and over, from a simple act to how the city acts. This could be implied in different ways, like smelling the detergent early morning with the maids cleaning the house, going to the supermarket and seeing the hand sanitizer all over covered, and Kleenex box covering most of our rooms. Actually, it's a Kuwaiti and a Khaliji condition going on. And how about these temporal acts act in an architectural manner? This is a project we did with a couple of my friends, Fatma Qadiri, Khalid Gharbelli, and Nano Al-Hamad. And we were talking about this ceremonial architectural event. And from there, I'll be presenting one project that I recently won Young Arab Architects at Venice Biennale and the Institut du Monde Arabe for their 25th anniversary. And basically, we mapped Kuwait City, and we found an area called Sha'b al-Khalid that has an old building, and we in-housed ourselves within this building. We started with the idea of temporal hygienic city, and we were talking about a saying that says, "اللي ما يعرف الصقر يشوي," one who doesn't know a falcon grills it. So we started to see this compound of 25 buildings that was built in the 60s by Mr. Zaid Al-Khalid. And basically, the way it is, it's a 25 buildings. Our building is the black one, and there is a central souk for people to buy their daily stuff in the 60s. And in this souk, it has a water reservoir and water tower. And this is the recent map of what's still existing, because the grandfather passed away and each of the inheritants started having their own plot and high-rise building. So we took our top floor of the building and started thinking about an atelier or an architectural studio that acts as a city, opening up to the street and to itself by hybriding 2 programs. So it's my house and my atelier at the same time. So we started knocking down the walls. At the beginning, it was hard because we are renting the space. We're not owning it. So it became a negotiation between us and the owner. And basically, the way we dealt with it is that the main space is sort of double-use space. So the living area would be a hangout space and a meeting area. And the working table would be the spine of the space, and the end of the table would be the meeting area with the contractors and specialists, and it could be a dining area for us at night. We opened up the courtyard because they used to use it for to hang their clothes for drying, but we don't use it anymore. We have a dryer, so we used it for our library. And then we used since we are on the top floor, we used the rooftop as a garden for us. So we inhabit ourselves within the satellite to create an urban condition. This is the living area, and this is the penetrated courtyard and the library. This is the spinal working table, and most of the as we're building this project, we thought that we want even furniture to act as a city. So most of the furniture would be new furniture growing from old pieces found in my friend's house, my family, or from a collection that I have from Kuwait. So the main table would be something that grows from an old table. We can see in a bit. And at the same time, we're being exposed to to Baghdad Street, which is a quite vibrant street, and we could be more in a communication with the outside. So it's a revisit for a building from the 60s, and we had a wall of light that projects us, and we could use it as an X-ray wall. This is the library. So this is the main table, and the base of this table is an old structure of a table that grows to create the spine. And we created a large storage to use for us as an inhabitants or as a workers in the studio and the entry. And the back table could be used as I said, as a meeting or a dinner table. That's the library. And most of the furniture grows from each other. It's the rooftop. And before submitting to Young Arab Architects, the old 50 years old Mashrabiya fell by a couple of labor who didn't know how to handle the lower part. So we photoshopped it for the competition, but we already told them about it, and we won, so we're good to go. And after that, we got negotiating with the client, with the owner, I mean, because they're quite stiff, and they were talking to us not to get that attached to the building and to the screen, and that mostly everything is going to get demolished in a couple of years whenever the market goes back to track. But we saw that the second building got renovated too, not just our building, and the second building got renovated, and a third building got renovated. So part of them, they're starting to pick up a sort of awareness for that, and some of them didn't. And then we moved to the central souk. I pushed a client of mine to create an Italian restaurant over there. So we're creating the new Lorenzo, in Souk Al Khalid. And from there, we got the attention of the owners of Souk Al Khalid, which is quite a beautiful building. And we're negotiating the idea of reusing it again right now. This is the water tower where they used to, it has four sides of Mashrabiyah, where they used to house the water for the 25 buildings, and now it's not in use anymore, so we want to understand a way of reusing it. This is the ground floor of the souk. This is the water reservoir. And this is the second floor, which is quite hidden, and it could be a new program injected in there. Yeah, so that's it. The exhibition is going to be in October in the Institut du Monde and August in Venice Biennial. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz. So now we would have a little coffee break to set down the set for the discussion, but I can't resist just to make a brief comment to each presentation, just 2 words. I think, Michael, there was a guy here that it's one of your architects publisher, that it's Alfred Ruth. Basically, he came in '64, he did the education report, and he defined the new guidelines for schools here. Nasser is very, I think your speech is very motivational for a young generation, and I think the identification of the opportunities, it's like critical for everyone that ambitions the development of a practice here. I would like also to refer that it's very interesting even the idea of the architectural community loop. Like there is an existence, you go up and down, and you need to pick the way up, and you need to know where you are going down. And on the other hand, I think the example of a competition is a very good showcase, case study of relation with foreign knowledge, with local production, and this is something here we should tackle. And I liked a lot how Aziz started the presentation with the idea of hygiene, because it's completely the idea that inspires the renovation process, preservation, reuse, and many times it's completely forgotten that that was the base of the beginning of 20th century, late 19th century, and the relation to preservation. Thank you. We will go a coffee break for 10 minutes.